The scream echoed through the Rocky Mountains of Colorado Territory like a gunshot, cutting through the autumn silence of 1876. And Asher Kincaid dropped the firewood he'd been gathering to sprint toward the sound without hesitation. His heart hammered in his chest as he pushed through the dense pine forest, his muscular legs carrying him swiftly over fallen logs and rocky terrain. Years of living alone in these mountains had honed his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being told him someone was in desperate trouble. The scream had been female, raw with pain and fear, and it pulled him forward like a rope around his chest. He found her 15 minutes later, crumpled at the base of a steep, rocky slope, her dark riding skirt torn and dusty. She was conscious but pale, her face twisted in agony as she clutched at her left ankle. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins, cascading around her shoulders in wild waves. A horse stood nervously about 20 yards away, reins dangling, flanks heaving. "Easy now," Asher called out softly as he approached, not wanting to startle her further. "I heard you cry out. Name's Asher Kincaid. I live up in these mountains." The woman's eyes snapped to him, wide with a mixture of relief and wariness. They were the color of honey in sunlight, he noticed, even filled with tears as they were. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler life than these harsh mountains usually saw. "My ankle," she gasped out. "I think it's broken. My horse spooked and I fell trying to keep hold of the reins." Asher knelt beside her, his large frame casting a shadow over her smaller form. Up close, he could see she was dressed for travel but not for serious riding in rough terrain. Her jacket was fine wool, her boots more decorative than practical. He carefully moved her hands away from her ankle, his calloused fingers gentle despite their size. "I'm going to need to check it," he said, meeting her eyes. "It's going to hurt, but I need to see what we're dealing with." She nodded, biting her lower lip. "Do what you need to do." As carefully as he could, Asher examined the injured ankle. It was already swelling badly, the skin discoloring. When he felt along the bone, she sucked in a sharp breath but didn't cry out. He admired her toughness even as his mind raced through options. They were a good 6 miles from his cabin and even farther from any town. "It's not broken clean through," he said finally, "but it's a bad sprain at minimum, maybe a fracture. Either way, you cannot walk on it. What's your name?" "Hannah," she managed through gritted teeth. "Hannah Porter. I was traveling to Fort Collins to meet my brother. He's stationed at the Army post there. My horse got spooked by a rattlesnake about a mile back, and I've been trying to control him ever since." Asher nodded, already formulating a plan. The sun was past its peak, which meant they had maybe 4 hours of good daylight left. Not enough time to get her all the way to Fort Collins, but enough to get her to his cabin where he could properly care for her injury and figure out next steps. "Miss Porter, I need to splint this ankle before we move you anywhere. I've got supplies back at my cabin, but I can make do with what's here for now. Then I'm going to have to carry you. It's not a short distance, but there's no other way. Carry me." Hannah's voice rose slightly. "Sir, I cannot possibly ask you to do that. Perhaps if we could get me on my horse. Your horse is spooked and you cannot sit a saddle with that ankle," Asher interrupted firmly but not unkindly. "Trust me, Miss Porter. I've carried elk carcasses farther than where we need to go. You don't weigh near as much as a bull elk." Despite her pain, Hannah felt her cheeks flush. She took in the man kneeling beside her properly for the first time. He was powerfully built, with broad shoulders straining against his worn flannel shirt and arms that looked like they could bend iron. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, tied back loosely with a leather cord. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were kind despite their intensity. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and competence. "I don't have much choice, do I?" she said quietly. "No, madam, you don't. But I give you my word, I'll get you somewhere safe and tend to that ankle proper." Asher worked quickly, using his knife to cut straight branches from a nearby pine. He fashioned a makeshift splint, padding it with strips torn from his own shirt, and bound it carefully to Hannah's ankle using leather cord from his pack. She made small sounds of pain but never complained, which raised his estimation of her even higher. Most society women he'd encountered over the years would have been hysterical by now. "Can you catch your horse?" Hannah asked as he finished securing the splint. Asher glanced at the nervous animal and nodded. He approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. The horse's ears flicked toward him, but it didn't bolt. Within a few minutes, he had the reins in hand and was leading the animal back. "I'll pony him along with us," Asher explained. "No sense leaving good horseflesh out here for the mountain lions." He gathered Hannah's scattered belongings, including a carpet bag that had fallen when she did, and secured them to the horse's saddle. Then he returned to where she sat, her face pale but composed. "This is going to be the hard part," he said gently. "I'm going to pick you up now. Try to keep that ankle still." Before she could respond, Asher slid one powerful arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Hannah gasped and instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, her heart racing at the sudden proximity to this stranger. But as he settled her weight against his broad chest, she felt an unexpected sense of safety. "Ready?" he asked, looking down at her with those steady eyes. "As I'll ever be," she replied. Asher began walking, his stride long and sure despite the burden he carried. He led Hannah's horse with his left hand while supporting her weight primarily with his right arm and shoulder. The muscles in his arms and chest flexed with each step, but he showed no sign of strain. For the first mile, Hannah tried to stay silent, not wanting to distract him from the difficult task of navigating the rough mountain terrain while carrying her. But as the journey continued and he showed no signs of tiring, curiosity got the better of her. "How long have you lived in these mountains?" she asked. "Going on 8 years now," Asher replied, his breathing still steady. "Came out here after the war ended. Wanted peace and quiet, and these mountains provide plenty of both. You were a soldier, Union Army, saw more blood and death than any man should see. When it was over, I just wanted to be somewhere far from people and their conflicts." His voice carried old pain, but also acceptance. Hannah was quiet for a moment, processing this. "And you've been alone all this time?" "Mostly. I trade pelts and meat in Fort Collins twice a year, but otherwise, yes. It's a solitary life, but it suits me." He adjusted his grip slightly, and Hannah was acutely aware of the warmth of his body against hers. "What about you? What brings a lady like yourself traveling alone through rough country?" "My brother wrote that he's being transferred to a post in Arizona Territory," Hannah explained. "I wanted to see him before he left. Our parents died 2 years ago, and James is all the family I have left. I came by train as far as I could, then hired a guide to take me the rest of the way to Fort Collins. But he took ill 2 days ago with a terrible fever. The doctor in the last town we stopped in said it might be typhoid and quarantined him. I couldn't wait, so I decided to continue alone. Clearly, that was a mistake." "A dangerous mistake," Asher agreed, "but a brave one. Not many women would attempt it." "Foolish is more like it," Hannah said with a bitter laugh that turned into a wince as pain shot through her ankle. "Hold still," Asher murmured. "We're coming to a rough patch." They had reached a section where the trail narrowed and ran alongside a steep drop. Asher moved with careful deliberation, testing each step before committing his weight. Hannah held her breath, trusting this stranger with her life because she had no other choice. His arms never wavered, holding her secure against his chest. When they finally cleared the dangerous section, Hannah let out a shaky breath. "Thank you. No thanks needed. Just doing what's right." The sun was sinking lower, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The temperature was dropping too, and Hannah shivered in her thin jacket. Asher noticed immediately. "We're about 2 miles out from my cabin," he said. "Can you hold on a bit longer?" "I'm fine," Hannah insisted, though her teeth were starting to chatter. Without breaking stride, Asher somehow maneuvered them so he could drape part of his heavy coat over her shoulders while still carrying her. The garment smelled of wood smoke, leather, and pine, and the warmth was immediate and welcome. "Better?" he asked. "Much better, thank you." Hannah found herself studying his profile as he walked. He had a strong jaw beneath that beard, and despite the weathered lines around his eyes, she guessed he wasn't much older than 30. There was something deeply masculine and capable about him that she'd never encountered in the genteel men of her acquaintance back in St. Louis. Those men wouldn't have lasted a day in this wilderness. "Why did you really come out here?" she asked softly. "There's more to it than wanting peace and quiet, isn't there?" Asher was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I did things in the war, necessary things, but that doesn't make them easier to live with. I watched friends die. I killed men who probably had families waiting for them to come home. When it was over, I felt like I had blood on my hands that wouldn't wash off. Out here, in the clean air and the silence, I found a way to live with myself again." The raw honesty in his voice moved Hannah deeply. "I'm sorry you went through that. War is hell, Miss Porter. That's all there is to say about it." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, with only the sound of Asher's footsteps and the horses' hooves crunching on the rocky trail. Hannah found herself growing drowsy despite the throbbing pain in her ankle. There was something about being held so securely, about the steady rhythm of Asher's breathing and the warmth of his body, that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since her parents died. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Asher was saying her name softly. "Miss Porter, Hannah, we're here." Hannah opened her eyes to find herself looking at a sturdy log cabin nestled against the mountainside, surrounded by towering pines. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and there was a small corral to one side where she could see 2 mules watching them with interest. The cabin was small but well-maintained, with a covered porch and shuttered windows. "It's not fancy," Asher said, carrying her toward the door, "but it's warm and dry." "It looks wonderful," Hannah said honestly. Asher managed to open the door while still holding her, then carried her inside. The cabin's interior was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a bed in the corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with supplies and books. It was sparse but clean, and blessedly warm from the fire that still burned in the hearth. He carried her to the bed and laid her down gently, propping her injured ankle on a folded blanket. "Let me get your horse settled, and then I'll take a proper look at that ankle." Before she could respond, he was gone. Hannah looked around the cabin with curiosity. The books on the shelves surprised her, volumes of poetry and philosophy mixed in with practical guides. There were beaver pelts stretched on frames along one wall and tools hung neatly on pegs. Everything had its place. Everything was orderly. It was the home of a man who had made peace with solitude. Asher returned within 10 minutes, carrying her carpet bag. He set it beside the bed, then moved to the fire to add more wood. The growing flames cast dancing shadows across his muscular frame. "I need to heat some water," he said. "Once I've got that ankle unwrapped and cleaned, I can assess the real damage and splint it properly." You know how to do that. Learned field medicine in the war. Had to. We didn't always have doctors available. He hung a pot of water over the fire, then turned to face her. This is going to hurt, Miss Porter. I won't lie to you about that, but I'll be as gentle as I can. Hannah nodded, steeling herself. She watched as Asher gathered supplies from around the cabin. Clean cloth, something that looked like willow bark, a bottle of what was probably whiskey, and more straight pieces of wood for a proper splint. When the water was warm, he brought it over in a basin along with the supplies. He pulled up a stool and sat down, then carefully began unwrapping the makeshift splint he'd applied in the field. "Tell me about St. Louis," he said as he worked. "It's been a long time since I was in a proper city." Hannah understood he was trying to distract her from the pain. "It's crowded and noisy and dirty," she said with a small smile. "But there are theaters and restaurants and shops filled with beautiful things. My father owned a printing business there. After he died, James wanted me to come live near him at whichever post he was stationed at, but I couldn't leave. Not right away. I had friends there, a life, but these past 2 years have felt hollow somehow. When James wrote about his transfer, I realized I had nothing keeping me in St. Louis anymore." "So this was more than just a visit," Asher observed, unwrapping the last of the cloth from her ankle. "The joint was badly swollen and deeply bruised." "I suppose it was," Hannah admitted. "I was thinking about starting over somewhere new, making a fresh start like you did when you came to these mountains." Asher met her eyes and something passed between them, an understanding of shared loss and the courage it took to begin again. Then he looked back at her ankle. "It's not broken," he said with relief, "but it's a severe sprain. You're going to need to stay off it completely for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Even after that, you'll need to be careful for a while longer." 2 weeks? Hannah's voice rose in dismay. "But my brother leaves in less than a month. I have to get to Fort Collins." "Your brother would rather you arrive with a healed ankle than cripple yourself permanently by walking on an injury like this too soon," Asher said firmly. "Trust me on this, Miss Porter. I've seen men lose the use of limbs because they didn't let injuries heal proper." Hannah felt tears of frustration prick her eyes. "But I cannot possibly impose on you for 2 weeks. You're a stranger. This is your home. I have already put you to so much trouble." "You're not imposing, you're injured," Asher said matter-of-factly. "And what kind of man would I be if I carried you all this way just to toss you out before you're healed?" His voice softened. "You'll stay here, Miss Porter, at least until you can walk again. There's no other sensible option." Before Hannah could protest further, he poured some of the whiskey over her ankle. She gasped at the burning sensation, her hands fisting in the blanket beneath her. I know, Asher murmured. "Just breathe through it." He worked with surprising gentleness for a man of his size and strength, cleaning the scraped skin around her ankle and checking for any signs of breaks in the skin that might lead to infection. His hands were calloused but careful, and Hannah found herself watching his face as he worked. There was a focused intensity in his expression, a determination to do the job right. "You're very skilled at this," she said softly. "Had plenty of practice, unfortunately." He began patting the splint with soft cloth. During the war, after major battles, it was all hands helping the wounded. Didn't matter if you were a soldier or a cook or a farrier. If you could set a bone or stitch a wound, you did it. That must have been horrible. It was. Asher positioned the wooden splints carefully on either side of her ankle. "Hold still now. I'm going to bind this tight. It needs to be secure to keep the joint from moving while it heals." Hannah braced herself as he began wrapping strips of cloth around the splint, binding it firmly in place. His movements were confident and efficient. When he finished, the splint was snug but not painfully tight. "There," he said with satisfaction. That should hold until you're healed. Now I'm going to brew you some willow bark tea. It will help with the pain and the swelling." "You don't have to fuss over me," Hannah protested weakly. "Not fussing, just being practical. You need to rest and heal." He stood up, and Hannah was once again struck by his sheer size and presence. "I'm going to make us some dinner too. You've had a rough day and you need to keep your strength up." As Asher moved around the cabin preparing the tea and starting dinner, Hannah found herself studying him with growing interest. Everything he did was accomplished with easy competence, from stoking the fire to slicing vegetables for a stew. He moved with the grace of a man completely at home in his environment. "You have many visitors out here?" she asked, accepting the cup of tea he brought her. It was bitter but not unpleasant. "Maybe 1 or 2 a year, usually trappers passing through." "You're the first woman who has ever been in this cabin." He stirred the pot hanging over the fire. "I'll sleep out on the porch tonight. You can have the bed." "I cannot take your bed," Hannah objected. "Please, I can make do on the floor or Miss Porter." Asher's voice was firm but kind. "You have an injured ankle. You're taking the bed and that's final. The porch is covered and I've slept in far worse places." Hannah sipped her tea, knowing argument was futile. "At least call me Hannah. If I'm going to be here for 2 weeks, there's no point in such formality." Asher glanced at her, a hint of something that might have been a smile beneath his beard. "All right then, Hannah, and you can call me Asher." "Asher," she repeated, finding she liked the way his name felt on her tongue. "That's an interesting name, biblical, my mother's choice." She had high hopes for my moral character. There was a touch of dry humor in his voice. "Not sure I've lived up to the name, but I've tried. I think saving strange women on mountainsides counts as living up to it," Hannah said softly. This time there was definitely a smile, brief but genuine. "Drink your tea. Dinner will be ready soon." They ate in companionable silence, sitting at the small table with Hannah's injured foot propped on a stool Asher had positioned for her. The stew was simple but hearty, thick with venison and root vegetables. Hannah realized she hadn't eaten since dawn and was famished. "This is delicious," she said appreciatively. "You're a good cook." "You learn when it's cook for yourself or starve," Asher replied. "Though I'll admit my repertoire is limited. Stew, roasted meat, beans, and cornbread, that's about it." "That's more than many men can manage. My brother can barely boil water without burning it." "Your brother is lucky he's in the army then. At least he gets fed regular." After dinner, Asher insisted on cleaning up while Hannah rested. The willow bark tea was working, dulling the sharp edge of pain in her ankle to a manageable throb. She watched him work, noting the easy strength in his movements as he carried the heavy pot to the door to scrape out the remnants for the forest animals. Night had fallen completely, and through the open door, Hannah could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The air that drifted in was cold and sharp with the promise of autumn's progression toward winter. "What month is it?" she asked suddenly, realizing she'd lost track of days during her journey. "October 20th, Asher replied, closing the door against the chill. "We'll likely see our first real snow within 2 weeks." The thought of being snowed in on this mountain with a man she'd only just met should have frightened Hannah, but strangely it didn't. There was something fundamentally decent about Asher Kincaid, something that made her feel safe despite the unusual circumstances. "I should write to my brother," she said. "He'll be expecting me in Fort Collins soon. He'll worry when I don't arrive." "I can ride down to Fort Collins in the morning," Asher offered. "It's a full day's ride there and back, but your brother should know you're safe. Do you know where to reach him?" "He's at Camp Collins, though I think they're calling it Fort Collins now. Lieutenant James Porter." Asher nodded. "I'll find him and explain what happened. I can also wire ahead if there's anyone else who needs to know you're all right." "There's no one else," Hannah said quietly. Just James. Something in her voice made Asher look at her more closely. You've lost a lot, haven't you? My parents died in a cholera outbreak 2 years ago. I had friends in St. Louis, but no one particularly close. James is my only real family. She managed a small smile. I suppose that makes me rather pathetic. It makes you human, Asher corrected gently. Loss is part of life. How we carry on afterward, that's what matters. Is that what you're doing out here, carrying on? Every day, he said simply. The honesty between them felt natural despite their short acquaintance. Hannah found herself wanting to know more about this quiet, capable man who had saved her life and was now opening his home to her. Tell me about the war, she said, if it's not too painful to speak of. Asher was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. I was at Gettysburg, he said finally. Fought all 3 days. Watched thousands of men die in those fields. The smell, the sound, the sheer waste of it all. By the time it was over, something in me had broken. I thought I'd never feel clean again. But you came out here and found peace. Some peace, he agreed. Not all of it. I still have nightmares sometimes. Still wake up thinking I'm back there. But in the daylight, working with my hands, living close to the land, I've found something like contentment. It's not the life I imagined as a young man, but it's honest work and it doesn't hurt anyone. What did you imagine? Hannah asked softly. The usual things, I suppose. A farm, a wife, children, building something lasting. He shook his head. But that was before. The man who wanted those things died somewhere in Pennsylvania in July of 1863. The man who came back just wanted silence. Hannah wanted to reach out to him to offer some comfort for the old pain she heard in his voice. But before she could find the words, Asher stood abruptly. You need rest, he said, his voice back to its usual practical tone. That ankle won't heal if you don't sleep. I'll get you settled, then make up my bedroll on the porch. He helped her stand, supporting her weight as she hopped awkwardly to the bed. Her face flushed with embarrassment at being so helpless, but Asher seemed completely unfazed. He treated her with the same careful competence he'd shown all day. You need anything else? He asked once she was settled under the heavy quilts. No, thank you. You've been more than kind already. Sleep well, Hannah. I'll be just outside if you need anything. Just call out. He banked the fire so it would burn low through the night, then gathered blankets and a bedroll. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. I'm glad I heard you scream today, he said quietly. Glad I could help. So am I, Hannah replied, meaning it with all her heart. After he left, closing the door gently behind him, Hannah lay in the darkness listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. Owls hooted in the distance, and something, probably a coyote, howled on a far ridge. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she'd been alone and frightened, injured and in pain. Now she was safe in the cabin of a mountain man who had carried her miles to safety without complaint. A man who seemed as comfortable with silence as with speaking, who had survived horrors she could barely imagine and come to this wild place seeking peace. Hannah had expected to feel afraid or uncomfortable, alone with a strange man in an isolated cabin. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. The thought should have worried her, but as sleep began to claim her, Hannah let it go. Tomorrow would bring its own questions and concerns. Tonight, she was safe and warm, and that was enough. Outside on the porch, wrapped in his bedroll with his rifle close at hand, Asher stared up at the stars through the pine branches and wondered at the strange workings of fate. For 8 years he'd lived alone on this mountain, content with solitude and silence. Then, in the space of a single afternoon, a woman with honey-colored eyes and courage to spare had tumbled into his life. She would leave as soon as she could walk, he reminded himself. Hannah Porter was a city woman, educated and refined. She had a brother waiting for her and a life beyond these mountains. There was no reason for her to stay once she was healed, and no reason for him to wish she would. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, Asher found himself hoping the next 2 weeks would pass slowly. Morning came with gray light filtering through the pines and the smell of rain in the air. Asher woke stiff from sleeping on the hard porch boards but accustomed to such discomfort. He rolled up his bedroll and went inside quietly, not wanting to wake Hannah if she was still sleeping. She was awake, though, sitting up in bed with her injured ankle still propped carefully on the folded blanket. Her hair was mussed from sleep and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of a restless night. "Good morning," he said softly. "How's the ankle?" "Sore," Hannah admitted. "But better than yesterday. The splint helped." "Good, that's what we want to hear." Asher moved to build up the fire. "I'll make breakfast, then head down to Fort Collins to find your brother. Will you be all right here alone for the day?" "I'll be fine," Hannah assured him. "Though I feel useless just lying here. Healing is hard work, even if it doesn't look like it. Your body needs rest to mend properly." He set about making coffee and frying up salt pork with cornmeal mush. "I'll leave you food and water within easy reach. The chamber pot is under the bed if you need it. Try not to put any weight on that ankle if you can help it." They ate breakfast together, and Asher found himself studying Hannah in the morning light. She was beautiful, he realized, though her beauty was the kind that grew on you rather than striking you immediately. Her features were delicate but strong, her honey-colored eyes intelligent and observant. There was a resilience to her that he admired. "What will you tell my brother?" Hannah asked as he prepared to leave. "The truth. That you fell, injured your ankle, and that I'm caring for you until you can travel safely. I'll tell him where you are and that you'll come to Fort Collins as soon as you're able. He'll probably want to come up here to check on me himself. He's welcome to, though the trail is rough. If he can spare the time away from his duties, I'll guide him up personally." Hannah nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you, Asher, for everything. No need to keep thanking me. Just rest and heal." He saddled his best mule, a sturdy animal named Buck who could handle the rough mountain trails, and headed out as the sun was breaking through the clouds. The ride to Fort Collins would take most of the day at a steady pace, which would leave him just enough time to find Lieutenant Porter and return before full dark. As he rode, Asher found his thoughts continually drifting back to the woman lying in his bed. Hannah Porter had disrupted his solitary existence completely, yet he found he didn't mind as much as he should. There was something compelling about her, something that made him want to know more about who she was and what had brought her to these mountains. But getting attached would be foolish. She was staying only until she healed, and then she'd be gone to join her brother, wherever the army sent him. There was no future in allowing himself to care. He repeated this to himself several times during the long ride, but somehow the message didn't quite stick. Hannah spent the day resting as instructed, though she chafed at the enforced inactivity. She was not accustomed to being idle. After a few hours, she began exploring what she could reach from the bed, studying the books on the nearby shelves. Asher's collection was eclectic and well-worn. There were volumes of Whitman and Thoreau, a Shakespeare collection, several agricultural guides, and, interestingly, a book of Greek philosophy. She pulled down the Thoreau and began reading, finding comfort in the familiar words about nature and solitude. By afternoon, she was hungry and carefully maneuvered herself to the table where Asher had left bread, cheese, and cold meat within reach. Getting there without putting weight on her ankle was awkward and exhausting, but she managed. Small victories, she told herself. As she ate, Hannah looked around the cabin with greater attention to detail. Everything spoke of a man who valued order and simplicity. The tools were well maintained, the floors swept clean, the dishes neatly stacked. There was a surprising lack of dust for a bachelor dwelling. Asher Kincaid took care of his space and possessions. On one wall hung a Confederate uniform jacket, faded and carefully preserved in a glass frame. Hannah studied it with interest, noting the sergeant's stripes. She had said he fought for the Union, hadn't he? Perhaps it was a souvenir from the war, taken from an enemy who had become a friend, or a fallen comrade. Either way, it clearly held significance. There was also a small daguerreotype on the shelf, showing a young man in Union blue standing beside an older couple. The young man's face was smooth-shaven and unlined by care, but Hannah recognized Asher's eyes. His parents, most likely. She wondered if they were still alive, if he ever went back to wherever home had been before the war. The afternoon passed slowly. Hannah rayed and dozed, her ankle throbbing steadily. She tried not to worry about Asher making the long journey alone, tried not to think about what her brother would say when he learned of her predicament. James would probably be furious that she'd attempted the journey without proper escort. He'd always been protective, even more so after their parents died. Shadows were lengthening when Hannah finally heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She felt a rush of relief that surprised her with its intensity. Asher pushed through the door moments later, looking tired but satisfied. "Found your brother," he announced. "Lieutenant Porter is a good man. Concerned about you, of course, but relieved to know you're safe. He wanted to come up immediately, but I convinced him to wait a few days. Let you get a bit more healed before he makes the rough journey." "Thank you," Hannah said. "What did he say?" "That you're stubborn as a mule and he should have known you'd try to make the journey alone." Asher's eyes crinkled with amusement. "He also said that your ankle better be completely healed before you try to travel again, and that I was to sit on you if necessary to keep you from doing anything foolish." Despite herself, Hannah laughed. "That sounds like James. He'll come up in 4 days to check on you. By then, hopefully, the swelling will be down and he can see for himself that you're on the mend." Asher moved to the fire to start dinner. "How was your day? Did you stay off the ankle?" "Mostly. I had to get to the table at one point, but I was very careful." "Good." He began preparing what looked like it would be another stew. "I brought some fresh supplies from town, real coffee, sugar, even some eggs. Figured we could both use a change from my usual fare." "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but I wanted to." He glanced at her. "Besides, you're my guest. Might as well feed you properly." They fell into an easy rhythm over the next few days. Asher would rise early and tend to his animals and various chores around the cabin. He'd make breakfast for both of them, then spend the day working while checking on Hannah regularly. In the evenings, they'd eat dinner together and talk. Hannah learned more about Asher's life with each passing day. He'd grown up in Ohio, the son of a farmer. He'd enlisted in 1862 at the age of 18, young and full of idealistic fervor for the Union cause. 4 years of war had burned away that idealism, leaving behind a man who no longer fit into normal society. "After I mustered out, I tried going home," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "But I couldn't settle, couldn't sleep in a soft bed, couldn't stand being around crowds. My parents tried to understand, but how could they? They hadn't seen what I'd seen. So you came west." "So I came west," he agreed. "Worked as a scout for a while, then as a hunter supplying meat to mining camps. Eventually saved enough to buy supplies and came up here. Built this cabin with my own hands, and for the first time since the war ended, I could breathe again." "Don't you get lonely?" Hannah asked. Asher considered this. Sometimes, but loneliness is easier to bear than feeling like a stranger among your own people. He looked at her. What about you? You said you stayed in St. Louis after your parents died. Why did it take 2 years to decide to leave? Fear, I suppose, Hannah said honestly. St. Louis was all I knew. My friends were there, my parents' graves. Leaving felt like abandoning them somehow. But this past year, I felt like I was just going through the motions of living rather than actually living. When James wrote about his transfer, something in me knew it was time. Time to be brave, time to start over. And now you're stuck on a mountain with a hermit, Asher said with dry humor. I don't see it as being stuck, Hannah replied softly. You saved my life, Asher. You've taken care of me with more kindness than I had any right to expect from a stranger. I'm grateful for every bit of it. Their eyes met across the firelight and something passed between them, something neither was quite ready to name. On the fourth day, James Porter arrived. He came riding up the mountain trail on a cavalry horse, his blue uniform crisp despite the journey. Asher heard him coming and went out to meet him while Hannah waited anxiously inside. Lieutenant Porter, Asher greeted him. Mr. Kincaid. James dismounted and shook Asher's offered hand. He was a tall man, about 26 years old, with the same auburn hair as his sister, though his eyes were blue rather than honey brown. I appreciate you taking care of Hannah. The doctor at Fort Collins said a sprain like you described could have crippled her if not treated properly. She's a tough one, your sister, hardly complained at all. James smiled slightly. That's Hannah, stubborn as they come. His expression turned serious. May I see her, of course. She's been anxious for you to arrive. Inside, Hannah's face lit up when her brother entered. James? Hannah. James crossed to the bed in a few long strides and pulled his sister into a careful hug. What were you thinking, traveling alone? You could have been killed. I know, I was foolish. But I wanted to see you before you left for Arizona, and I couldn't wait for the guide to recover. I thought I could manage. Well, you couldn't, James said, but his voice was gentle. Thank God Mr. Kincaid found you when he did. He examined her splinted ankle carefully. How does it feel? Much better. The swelling has gone down, and as long as I keep weight off it, the pain is manageable. James looked at Asher with newfound respect. You did excellent work with this splint. Are you trained in medicine? Just field medicine from the war. But I've set my share of broken bones and treated sprains over the years. You were a soldier. Yes, sir. 5th Ohio Infantry, Union Army. Recognition lit James's eyes. 5th Ohio was at Gettysburg, wasn't it? All 3 days. The two men shared a look of understanding that needed no words. James had clearly seen his share of combat as well. How long before she can travel? James asked. Another week at minimum, maybe 2 to be safe. Once the swelling is completely gone and she can put some weight on it without pain, I can take her down to Fort Collins on my mule. It will be a slow journey, but manageable. I hate to impose on your hospitality for that long, James began. It's no imposition, Asher said firmly. She's welcome to stay as long as she needs to heal properly. James studied the mountain man thoughtfully, then glanced at his sister. Hannah's cheeks were slightly pink, and there was something in the way she looked at Asher that caught James's attention. Well then, James said slowly, I suppose that's settled. Hannah, you'll stay here until Mr. Kincaid says you're fit to travel. And you, he pointed at his sister sternly, will follow his instructions to the letter. No trying to walk before you're ready, no pushing yourself. Understood? Yes, James, Hannah said meekly, though her eyes sparkled with amusement at her brother's commanding tone. James stayed for a few hours, sharing the midday meal with them and telling Hannah about his preparations for the transfer to Arizona. The post there was near Tucson, and he'd be commanding a small cavalry troop responsible for protecting settlers and supply lines. "It's frontier duty," he explained. "Rough and dangerous but important work. I'm taking a small detachment of good men with me." "Will you have decent quarters?" Hannah asked, worry clear in her voice. "Better than a tent, worse than a hotel," James said with a smile, "but adequate. There's even talk of bringing in some civilians to establish a proper town near the fort. Who knows, maybe you'd like it there once you've had enough of army posts." "Maybe," Hannah said noncommittally. Before James left, he pulled Asher aside while Hannah was resting. "I want to thank you again," James said seriously. "My sister is all the family I have left. If something had happened to her out here, alone and injured, I would never have forgiven myself for not insisting she wait for a proper escort. She's safe now. That's what matters." James hesitated, then said, "Can I speak frankly, Mr. Kincaid?" "Of course. I saw the way my sister looks at you, and I saw the way you look at her when you think no one's watching. I'm not a fool, and I know what two young people alone together for weeks might lead to." Asher stiffened slightly. "Lieutenant Porter, I give you my word as a gentleman that your sister's virtue is completely safe with me. I have been and will continue to be nothing but respectful." "I believe you," James said, "but I also know my sister. She's lonely and she's been adrift since our parents died. You're a good man, Kincaid, that's obvious, but you're also a mountain hermit who's chosen a solitary life. Hannah deserves more than that. She deserves a home, a family, stability." "I know that," Asher said quietly. "Better than you might think. Your sister will heal and go on to Fort Collins, and I'll go back to my life here. That's how it has to be. As long as we understand each other." James offered his hand again. "I'll come back in a week to check on her progress." After James left, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Hannah was subdued, clearly missing her brother already. Asher tried to give her space while still tending to her needs, but the easy companionship they'd developed over the past few days felt strained. That evening, as they ate dinner in near silence, Hannah finally spoke. "Did my brother say something to you? When you spoke outside?" Asher considered lying but decided on honesty. "He reminded me that you're his sister and under his protection, that you deserve a good life with a future in it." "And what did you say?" "That he was right, that you'd heal and go on to Fort Collins as planned." Hannah set down her fork with more force than necessary. "Don't I get a say in what I deserve or what my future holds?" "Of course you do, but your brother cares about you, Hannah. He wants you to be happy and safe." "And you think I cannot be happy and safe here?" The question hung in the air between them. Asher met her eyes and saw the challenge in them, the spark of something he'd been trying very hard not to acknowledge. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're a woman who has known comfort and society and culture. You're educated and refined. This cabin is a far cry from St. Louis, and this life is harder than anything you've experienced. Your brother is right to want more for you than isolation on a mountain with a scarred soldier who barely remembers how to talk to people. That's what you think of yourself." Hannah's voice was soft with sympathy. "Asher, I have seen nothing but kindness and capability from you. You saved my life. You've taken care of me with more gentleness than I have known in years. Don't you dare suggest you're not worthy of anything you might want." "It's not about worthy," Asher said, his voice rough. "It's about practical. You have your whole life ahead of you, Hannah. Don't make decisions based on gratitude or proximity or whatever else you might be feeling right now." "How do you know what I'm feeling?" "I don't," Asher admitted. "But I know what I'm feeling, and it's not fair to you. You're beautiful and brave and kind, and you've brought light into this cabin that I didn't even realize I was missing. But that doesn't change facts. In a week or two, you'll be healed. You'll go to Fort Collins, spend time with your brother, and realize this was all just a strange interlude brought on by extraordinary circumstances. "And what if it's not?" Hannah asked quietly. "What if this isn't just gratitude or proximity? What if I'm starting to care about you, really care, in a way I haven't cared about anyone in a very long time?" Asher felt his heart constrict in his chest. "Hannah, I know it's fast," she continued. "I know it seems impossible. But I've spent 2 years feeling nothing, going through the motions of a life that had no real meaning. Then I fell down that mountain, and you caught me, literally and figuratively. These past few days, talking with you, learning about who you are, I've felt more alive than I have in years. You barely know me. I know you're good and honest. I know you've been hurt by your past, but you're not letting it make you bitter. I know you live with integrity even when there's no one around to see it. I know the sound of your voice makes me feel safe, and the sight of you makes my heart beat faster." She met his eyes steadily. "Is that not knowing you?" Asher stood abruptly, needing distance to think clearly. "You should rest. It's been a long day with your brother's visit." Hannah's face fell with disappointment, but she didn't argue. "Of course. Good night, Asher." "Good night." He escaped to the porch where the cold night air helped clear his head. What Hannah had said echoed in his mind, dangerous and tempting. Because the truth was, he was starting to care about her too. More than care. In just a few short days, she'd become the thing he thought about when he woke up and the last thing on his mind before sleep. Her laughter had filled his cabin with warmth. Her presence had reminded him what it was like to have someone to talk to care for. But James Porter was right. Hannah deserved better than a life of isolation with a damaged man on a remote mountain. She deserved parties and theaters and friends. She deserved children and a real home and all the things civilization could offer. Even if he wanted to ask her to stay, what right did he have? What could he offer her except hard work and loneliness? Asher stared up at the stars, the same stars he'd found so peaceful for 8 years. And for the first time since coming to this mountain, he felt the weight of his solitude not as peace but as loss. Inside the cabin, Hannah lay awake with tears silently tracking down her cheeks. She'd been too bold, too forward. She'd frightened him away with her honesty. But how could she not be honest when the truth was so clear to her? She'd spent 2 years among people who cared about her but didn't really see her. Asher saw her. In just a few days, he'd seen more of who she really was than people she'd known for years. And she saw him too, saw past the rough exterior and the self-imposed exile to the good man beneath. Was it so wrong to want to hold on to that? To want to explore where these feelings might lead? But he'd made his position clear. He saw her as a temporary responsibility, nothing more. Once she healed, he expected her to leave and never look back. The thought of leaving made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with her injured ankle. The next few days were awkward. Asher was unfailingly polite and attentive to Hannah's needs, but he maintained a careful distance. Their easy conversations became stilted. The comfortable silences became tense. Hannah's ankle continued to improve. The swelling went down significantly, and she could put more weight on it without sharp pain. Asher fashioned her a crutch from a sturdy branch, and she began moving around the cabin more independently. On the 8th day after her accident, Hannah woke to find snow falling softly outside the cabin windows. It was the first real snow of the season, not just flurries but steady, purposeful snowfall that began to accumulate on the ground. "First snow came early this year," Asher commented at breakfast. "Usually don't see this much until November." "It's beautiful," Hannah said, watching the flakes drift past the window. "It's also going to make travel difficult. The trail down to Fort Collins will be treacherous with snow on it." Hannah felt a secret spark of relief. If the trail was dangerous, she couldn't leave yet. She'd have more time in this cabin, more time with Asher, even if he was determined to keep his distance. "How long will the snow last?" she asked. "Hard to say. Could melt off in a few days if we get warm weather. Could keep coming and be here until spring. October snow is unpredictable." James arrived the next day, his horse laboring through 6 inches of new snow. He looked concerned when Asher met him outside. "How's the trail from here down?" Asher asked. "Rough," James admitted. "Had to walk my horse in several places. It will only get worse if we get more snow." "Then Hannah cannot travel yet. Even with her ankle healing well, that trail is too dangerous right now." James frowned but nodded. "I have to return to Fort Collins tonight. We're moving out for Arizona Territory in 3 days. The transfer orders came through faster than expected. 3 days. Asher felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I thought you had another month." "So did I, but the situation in Arizona has deteriorated. They need experienced officers there immediately." James looked toward the cabin. "I need to say goodbye to Hannah, and we need to discuss what happens next." Inside, Hannah's face went pale when James told her about the accelerated transfer. 3 days. "James, I cannot be ready in 3 days. My ankle." "I know." James took her hands. "Hannah, I need you to understand something. I'll be gone for at least 2 years, maybe longer. The posting in Arizona is not somewhere you can just come visit. It's dangerous territory, and they're not allowing officers to bring family until things stabilize." "What are you saying?" Hannah asked, though she suspected she knew. "I'm saying you need to decide where you want to be, what you want to do. You can try to make it to Fort Collins before I leave, though with your ankle and the snow, that's risky. Or you can wait until spring, heal completely, and then decide where you want to go. Stay here until spring." Hannah glanced at Asher, who was standing by the door looking uncomfortable. "James, I cannot impose on Mr. Kincaid for months." "Is it an imposition?" James asked Asher directly. "Because if it is, tell me now and I'll get Hannah to Fort Collins somehow, even if I have to carry her myself." Asher met Hannah's eyes across the cabin. In that moment, all the careful distance he'd maintained crumbled. The thought of her trying to navigate that treacherous snow-covered trail with a barely healed ankle, or worse, staying in Fort Collins alone with no family and little money while her brother was in Arizona, was unbearable. "It's not an imposition," he said quietly. "She's welcome to stay as long as she needs to, even if that's months," James pressed. "Even if that's months." James studied them both, seeing something in the tension between them that made him sigh. "All right then. Hannah, you'll stay here through the winter. In the spring, when the trails are clear and your ankle is fully healed, you can decide what you want to do. Come to Arizona if the situation has stabilized, or go back to St. Louis, or—" He paused meaningfully. "Make whatever choice seems right to you." "James, I cannot just stay here with Asher all winter. People will talk. My reputation." "Your reputation will survive better than you would trying to travel with that ankle," James said firmly. "Besides, there's no one up here to talk except the mules, and I don't think they'll judge. As for Fort Collins, I'll make sure people know you're staying with a respectable widower who is acting as your guardian while you heal." "I'm not a widower," Asher interjected. "They don't need to know that. As far as anyone in Fort Collins is concerned, you're a widowed mountain man acting out of Christian charity. It will protect Hannah's reputation." James looked at his sister seriously. "Hannah, I know this isn't ideal, but it's the best option we have. Promise me you'll stay here, stay safe, and let your ankle heal completely." "I promise," Hannah said softly. James pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'll write when I can. The mail service to Arizona is irregular, but I'll send letters whenever possible. You can send replies to my post address." "I'll miss you," Hannah whispered. "I'll miss you too. But we're both starting new chapters, sister. Maybe being apart for a while will help us both figure out who we're supposed to be." After James left, riding back down the snowy trail toward his departure to a new life, the cabin felt very quiet. "I should make dinner," Asher said finally. "Asher, wait." Hannah hopped over to him using her crutch, balancing carefully. "We need to talk about this. I cannot stay here all winter without us addressing what's happening between us." "Nothing is happening between us." "That's a lie and you know it." Hannah's voice was gentle but firm. "I understand you're scared. I understand this isn't what you planned or wanted. But we're going to be living in close quarters for months. We cannot keep dancing around this." Asher ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What do you want me to say, Hannah? That I care about you, I do. That I think about you constantly, I do that too. That every day you're here makes it harder to imagine this cabin without you. All of that is true, but it doesn't change anything." "Why not?" "Because you deserve better than this." The words burst out of him with surprising force. "You deserve a husband who can take you to parties and give you a nice house in a real town. You deserve friends and culture and all the things you grew up with. I'm a hermit who chose to live alone because I couldn't stand being around people. What kind of life is that for someone like you?" "Someone like me?" Hannah moved closer to him, her honey-colored eyes blazing. "You mean someone who lost her parents and spent 2 years feeling dead inside? Someone who was so lost that she risked traveling alone through dangerous territory just to feel something again?" "Asher, I don't want parties. I don't want a house in town. I want to feel alive, and the only time I've felt truly alive in 2 years has been here with you." "You only feel that way because I saved you, because you're grateful." "Stop telling me what I feel," Hannah interrupted. "I'm not a child and I'm not confused. Yes, you saved me. Yes, I'm grateful. But that's not why my heart races when you walk into the room. That's not why I find myself watching you when you work, admiring your strength and competence. That's not why I lie awake at night wishing you were sleeping next to me instead of out on that cold porch." Asher felt heat rise in his face at her bold words. "Hannah, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," she continued. "I'm not asking you to change your whole life. I'm just asking you to be honest about what's happening between us. To stop pushing me away because you think you know what's best for me." They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with everything they'd been holding back. The snow continued to fall outside, soft and silent, cocooning them in this moment. "I'm terrified," Asher admitted finally, his voice raw. "I'm terrified of caring about someone again, of having someone to lose. I'm terrified that you'll realize I'm not what you need and leave, and I'll be even more alone than I was before. And I'm terrified that you'll stay and regret it, that this mountain life will slowly crush the light out of you until you hate me for letting you choose it." Hannah reached up and touched his bearded cheek gently. "Those are all valid fears, but let me tell you mine. I'm terrified of leaving here and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. I'm terrified of being safe and comfortable and dead inside again. I'm terrified of never again feeling the way I feel when I'm with you." "And how is that?" Asher asked softly, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against his face. "Seen," Hannah whispered. "Valued. Alive." The last of Asher's resistance crumbled. He pulled her gently into his arms, careful of her injured ankle, and held her close. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucking under his chin, her arms wrapping around his waist. "I cannot promise you an easy life," he said into her hair. "This mountain is harsh and the winters are long. You'd be isolated from society, from other women, from all the comforts you're used to." "I don't need easy," Hannah replied. "I need real, I need honest, I need you." Asher pulled back just enough to look down at her face. In the firelight she was beautiful, her eyes shining with unshed tears and hope. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like they were both afraid the other might disappear. But as Hannah responded, rising up on her good foot to deepen the kiss, it became something more. It became a promise, a beginning, an acknowledgement of everything they'd been fighting against. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Asher rested his forehead against Hannah's. "We should take this slow," he said. "You're going to be here all winter. We have time to figure out what this is, what it could be." "Slow sounds wise," Hannah agreed, though the smile on her face suggested she'd rather skip slow entirely. "I'll still sleep on the porch," Asher said firmly. "Your reputation. In the snow, don't be ridiculous. You'll freeze. I've slept in worse conditions. Asher Kincaid, I will not have you catching your death of cold for some misguided attempt to protect my virtue. If we're truly taking this slowly and properly, then we can both be adults about sharing space in this cabin." She met his eyes with determination. "Besides, James already told people you're a widower acting as my guardian. A guardian wouldn't sleep on the porch in the snow." He wanted to argue, but she had a point. And the truth was, he was tired of the cold porch and the hard boards. "I'll make a bedroll by the fire. That's my final offer." "That's acceptable," Hannah said with satisfaction. The days that followed settled into a new pattern. Asher continued his normal routines of hunting, tending to his animals and managing the firewood supply. Hannah, growing steadier on her ankle each day, began helping with tasks she could do sitting down, mending clothes, preparing vegetables for meals, even helping to scrape and treat the pelts Asher brought in from his trap lines. But now, underlying everything was an awareness of each other that they no longer tried to hide. Asher would catch himself watching Hannah as she worked, admiring the way firelight turned her auburn hair to copper. Hannah would look up to find his eyes on her and smile, a secret smile that made his heart stumble in his chest. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Asher told her about his childhood on the Ohio farm, about a younger brother who had died of fever when they were children, about his mother's love of poetry and his father's quiet strength. Hannah spoke of her parents' print shop, of learning to set type as a girl, of her mother's garden and her father's terrible jokes. "They would have liked you," Hannah said one night as they sat by the fire. "My parents. They valued honesty and hard work above social status. My father especially would have respected what you've built here." "I would have been honored to know them," Asher replied. He hesitated, then added, "My parents are still alive as far as I know. I sent them a letter when I first came to this mountain, letting them know I was all right. But I haven't written since. Didn't know what to say. Sorry I disappeared, I just couldn't stand being around people anymore, seemed inadequate." "Maybe you could write to them now," Hannah suggested gently. "You're not the same man who left. Maybe they deserve to know who you've become." "Maybe," Asher said noncommittally, but Hannah could see he was considering it. 2 weeks into Hannah's stay, she insisted on trying to help with dinner preparation. Her ankle was much stronger now, and she could stand on it for short periods without pain. "You're going to let me cook tonight," she announced. "I cannot eat another meal while you do all the work." "You're supposed to be resting," Asher protested. "I've been resting for 2 weeks. I'm going mad from inactivity. Please let me do something useful." Reluctantly, Asher agreed. He showed her where everything was stored, amused by her determination. What he didn't expect was how much he'd enjoy cooking with her. They moved around each other in the small kitchen space, occasionally bumping hips or brushing arms. Each touch sent awareness skittering through him. Hannah made biscuits from scratch, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she kneaded the dough. Asher had never thought baking could be attractive, but watching her work with such focus made him want to kiss her flour-dusted nose. "What?" Hannah asked, catching him staring. "Nothing. You just look very serious about those biscuits." "Biscuits are serious business, Mr. Kincaid. My mother taught me that perfect biscuits are the mark of a civilized society." He laughed, the sound surprising both of them. Asher couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed out loud. The biscuits turned out perfectly, light and flaky. Combined with Asher's venison stew, it was one of the best meals he'd had in years. They ate in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing smiles across the table. After dinner, as they were cleaning up, Asher said, "You know, if you're feeling up to it, I could teach you to shoot. It's a useful skill to have out here." "I'd like that," Hannah said eagerly, "though I'm not sure how good I'll be." Everyone starts somewhere. The next afternoon, when the weather cleared slightly, Asher took Hannah outside for her first shooting lesson. The world was transformed by snow, everything white and pristine. Hannah breathed deeply of the cold, clean air, feeling more alive than she could remember feeling in years. Asher set up targets against a snowbank, then showed Hannah how to hold the rifle properly. He stood behind her, his arms coming around to adjust her grip, and Hannah had to focus very hard on his instructions rather than the feeling of being held in his strong arms. "Keep the stock tight against your shoulder," he instructed. "The kick will bruise you if you don't. Now, sight down the barrel, take a breath, let half of it out and squeeze the trigger gently." The rifle cracked loudly in the quiet mountain air, and the recoil drove into Hannah's shoulder. She missed the target completely, but she was grinning. "Again," she demanded. They spent an hour practicing. By the end, Hannah was managing to hit the target more often than not, and her shoulder was definitely going to be sore tomorrow, but she felt triumphant. "You're a natural," Asher said with genuine admiration. "Give it a few more sessions and you'll be able to hunt small game yourself. Could you teach me to trap as well? And to recognize edible plants and how to read the weather and everything else you know about living out here?" "Planning to become a mountain woman, Miss Porter?" Asher teased, though his eyes were serious. "Maybe I am," Hannah replied, equally serious beneath her light tone. "Knowledge is never wasted after all." As November arrived and the snow deepened, the cabin became their entire world. Asher's trap lines kept him busy during the days, but the shortened daylight hours meant more time together in the evenings. They fell into domestic routines that felt natural and right. Hannah proved to be a quick learner at all the mountain skills Asher taught her. She learned to identify animal tracks in the snow, to predict storms by the behavior of the birds and the smell of the air. She learned to prepare hides properly and to make useful items from what Asher hunted. One particularly cold evening, Asher came in from checking his traps to find Hannah had made the cabin especially cozy. She'd hung blankets over the windows to keep out drafts, built up the fire, and was attempting to knit something that might eventually become a scarf. "What's all this?" he asked, stomping snow off his boots. "It's going to be a very cold night," Hannah explained. "I could feel it in the air this afternoon, so I thought we should prepare accordingly. There's hot stew in the pot and I made extra biscuits. And I'm making you a scarf, though I warn you, my knitting skills are rusty." Asher felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. This was what it felt like to come home to someone, he realized, to have someone care whether you were warm and fed. He'd forgotten how good it could feel. "Thank you," he said softly. "You're welcome." Hannah smiled at him, and in that moment, Asher knew with certainty that he was falling in love with her, perhaps had already fallen. The realization should have terrified him, but instead, It felt like finally accepting something he'd been fighting since the day he'd found her injured on that mountainside. That night, as a blizzard howled outside and the cabin creaked under the assault of wind and snow, they sat close together by the fire. Asher had his arm around Hannah's shoulders, and her head rested against his chest. They didn't need words. The storm raged, but inside they were warm and safe and together. "Are you scared?" Hannah asked quietly. "Of the storm? No, it's not the worst I've seen. Not of the storm, of this." She gestured between them. "Of us." Asher was quiet for a moment, then said honestly, "Yes, terrified. But also happier than I've been in longer than I can remember." Hannah tilted her head up to look at him. "Me too." He kissed her then, slow and deep, with all the emotion he didn't quite have words for. When they broke apart, Hannah's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "Asher," she whispered, "I think I'm falling in love with you." "I know I'm falling in love with you," he replied. "Probably have been since you told me off for trying to protect your reputation by freezing on the porch." Hannah laughed, the sound like music in the quiet cabin. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both running from our pasts, both finding something unexpected in the middle of a Colorado winter." "Best thing I ever found," Asher said, pulling her closer. The storm lasted 3 days, burying the cabin in snow up to the windowsills. They were completely isolated from the world, but neither minded. They talked and read aloud to each other from Asher's books. Hannah taught him some of the songs her mother used to sing, and though his voice was rusty from disuse, he joined in eventually. They cooked together, ate together, existed together in perfect contentment. When the storm finally passed, the world outside was transformed into a glittering winter wonderland. The sun returned with blinding intensity, reflecting off the fresh snow until everything seemed to glow. "It's beautiful," Hannah breathed, looking out at the pristine landscape. "It is," Asher agreed, but he was looking at her rather than the scenery. As December arrived, they began preparing for Christmas. It was Hannah's idea, as Asher admitted he hadn't celebrated the holiday since before the war. "Well, we're celebrating this year," Hannah declared, "even if it's just the two of us. Especially because it's just the two of us." They had limited resources, but Hannah was creative. She made decorations from pine cones and evergreen branches. She used scraps of fabric to sew small ornaments. Asher cut down a small pine tree and they set it up in the corner, decorating it with Hannah's creations. For gifts, they had to be equally inventive. Hannah had been working in secret on the scarf she'd started, and she also made him new thick socks from wool she'd unraveled from an old blanket and reknit. Asher carved her a beautiful hair comb from a piece of antler, decorated with delicate designs, and also made her a pair of sturdy boots from deer hide, sized perfectly to her feet. On Christmas Eve, they made a special dinner with some of the treats Asher had traded for on his last trip to Fort Collins: real coffee, sugar, dried fruit. Hannah made a cake that was more pudding than cake given the limited ingredients, but it was sweet and delicious nonetheless. "I have something else for you," Asher said after dinner. He retrieved a small package wrapped in cloth from where he'd hidden it. Hannah opened it to find a book, clearly old but well cared for. "Jane Eyre," she read from the cover. "Asher, this is lovely, but isn't this from your collection?" "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She gave it to me before I went off to war, said it might remind me that there was beauty and love in the world even when things seemed darkest. I've kept it all these years. I want you to have it now." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "I cannot take something so precious to you. You can because you're precious to me, more precious than I thought anyone could be." Asher took her hands. "Hannah, these past months with you have given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. Joy." the ability to imagine a future that's more than just surviving day to day. You've reminded me what it means to truly live. You've done the same for me, Hannah said through her tears. Before I fell down that mountain, I was just going through the motions. Now I wake up every morning glad to be alive, excited to see what the day will bring. They kissed beneath their decorated pine tree, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and both knew that this Christmas would be remembered as the one where everything changed. On Christmas morning, Hannah surprised Asher by announcing she had one more gift for him. "What is it?" he asked, looking around in confusion. "Close your eyes and hold out your hands." Curious, he complied. Hannah placed something small and warm in his palms. "Okay, you can look." Asher opened his eyes to find a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully and read, "Dear Mother and Father, I know it has been years since you heard from me, and I apologize for my silence. I came to these mountains to find peace, and I did find it, though not in the way I expected. This Christmas, I'm sharing my cabin with a remarkable woman named Hannah Porter who quite literally fell into my life. She has reminded me that healing doesn't mean hiding from the world, just finding the right place in it. I'm well. I'm happy. And I want you to know I'm ready to be your son again if you'll have me. Your son, Asher." He looked up at Hannah with amazement. "You wrote this for me." "I wrote what I thought you might want to say. You can change it or write your own entirely. But I thought maybe having a starting point would make it easier to actually send it." She smiled hopefully. "Was I too presumptuous?" "You were perfect," Asher said, pulling her into his arms. "How did I get so lucky?" "You listened for screaming women on mountainsides," Hannah replied with a laugh. "It was destiny." Asher did send the letter, adding a few lines of his own on the next mail run to Fort Collins. It would take months to get a reply, but just sending it felt like closing one chapter and opening another. January and February passed in a blur of snow and cold and growing love. Hannah's ankle healed completely, to the point where she could hike with Asher to check his trap lines. She could shoot accurately now, and had even brought down a rabbit on her own, much to her pride and Asher's vocal praise. They'd fallen into a comfortable domesticity that felt as natural as breathing. Hannah managed the cabin while Asher worked outdoors. They shared all the tasks, from cooking to cleaning to tending the animals. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence, and they were growing more physically comfortable with each other as well. The kisses became more frequent and more passionate. Asher had moved from his bedroll by the fire to sharing the bed with Hannah, though they maintained a respectable distance, and he kept his word about protecting her virtue. But they would fall asleep in each other's arms and wake up the same way, and both were acutely aware that the tension between them was building towards something inevitable. One night in late February, as they lay together in the darkness, Hannah said softly, "Asher, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He could hear the seriousness in her tone. "When spring comes and the trails are clear, I'm not leaving. I've already decided. This is where I want to be, with you, for as long as you'll have me." Asher's heart pounded in his chest. "Hannah, are you sure? You haven't seen Fort Collins or any other option. You haven't had time away from this cabin to really think about what you're choosing." "I don't need to see other options. I know what I want." She rolled to face him in the darkness. "I love you, Asher Kincaid. I love you completely and entirely. And I want to build a life with you here on this mountain, if you'll let me. If I'll let you." Asher's voice was rough with emotion. "Hannah, I've been terrified you'd leave since the moment I started falling in love with you. Having you stay, building a life together, that's everything I want but was too afraid to ask for." "Then ask for it now," Hannah whispered. "Marry me," Asher said, the words coming easily now that he'd let himself say them. "Hannah Porter, will you marry me? Will you stay on this mountain and be my wife and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" "Yes," Hannah said, tears streaming down her face even as she laughed. "Yes, yes, yes." They kissed deeply, desperately, joyfully. And that night, with the promise of forever between them, they finally consummated the love that had been growing since that first day on the mountainside. When spring finally arrived in late March, melting the snow and bringing green back to the world, Asher and Hannah made the journey down to Fort Collins. The town had grown since Asher's last visit, with more buildings and more people. But it wasn't Fort Collins they'd come for primarily. They were married in a small church on a sunny April morning, with the preacher and his wife serving as witnesses. Hannah wore a simple dress she'd made herself over the winter from fabric Asher had surprised her with from his stores. Asher had trimmed his beard and put on his cleanest clothes. They exchanged vows with tears in their eyes and absolute conviction in their hearts. After the ceremony, they sent a telegram to James in Arizona, letting him know his sister was now Hannah Kincaid. They also posted letters to Asher's parents with the news, along with a wedding photograph taken by a traveling photographer who happened to be in town. They spent 2 days in Fort Collins, stocking up on supplies they'd need for the coming year. Hannah insisted on buying more fabric and books. Asher purchased better medical supplies and some seeds for Hannah's expressed intention to plant a garden. On the second day, they ran into the doctor James had mentioned, Dr. Morrison. He examined Hannah's ankle and pronounced it completely healed. "Your husband did excellent work, doctor," Morrison said. "Clean splint, proper care. You're very lucky he found you when he did, Mrs. Kincaid." "I know," Hannah said, smiling at Asher. "I'm the luckiest woman alive." They returned to the mountain cabin in early May, when the wildflowers were beginning to bloom and the world smelled of pine and possibility. As they crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view, Hannah felt a surge of homecoming so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kincaid," Asher said softly, helping her down from the mule. "Home," Hannah repeated, testing the word. It fit perfectly. That summer, they worked together to enlarge the cabin, adding a second room that could serve as a proper bedroom. Asher also built Hannah a covered porch on the sunny side where she could sit and read or work. Hannah planted her garden, and to her delight, it flourished in the mountain soil. In June, a letter arrived from Asher's parents. His mother had written, her words full of joy and relief at hearing from him after so many years. She and his father were thrilled he'd found happiness and love. They hoped to meet Hannah someday, though they understood the distance, and difficulty made that uncertain. Asher read the letter aloud to Hannah as they sat on her new porch, and when he finished, he had to wipe his eyes. "They don't hate me for disappearing," he said with wonder. "Of course not. They're your parents. They love you." Hannah squeezed his hand. "Maybe we could visit them next year if you wanted. Make the journey to Ohio." "Maybe we could," Asher agreed and began to compose a reply. August brought a letter from James, full of congratulations and teasing about his little sister being married before he was. He wrote that Arizona territory was as rough as expected, but he was settling in. He hoped to get leave to visit them next year and meet his new brother-in-law properly. As autumn arrived and the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, Hannah began to suspect she might be pregnant. By October, she was certain. She told Asher on the anniversary of the day they'd met, exactly 1 year after she'd fallen down the mountainside and he'd carried her to safety. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. "Our baby. Probably sometime in April." Asher's face went through several emotions so quickly Hannah couldn't track them all. Fear, joy, wonder, terror, and finally landing on something that looked like awe. "A baby," he repeated. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy." Asher picked her up and spun her around carefully. "Hannah, I'm terrified and thrilled and amazed. I'm going to be a father. We're going to be parents. How could I be anything but happy?" They spent that winter preparing for the baby's arrival. Asher built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine wood, carved with delicate designs of mountain flowers and animals. Hannah sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They read books about childbirth and infant care that Dr. Morrison had given them. As Hannah's pregnancy progressed, Asher became even more protective than usual. He insisted she rest more, do less heavy work. He fussed over her eating enough, staying warm enough, being comfortable enough. Hannah found it endearing even when it bordered on excessive. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she laughingly protested when he tried to carry her to the table for dinner one night. "You're carrying our child," Asher replied seriously. "I'm allowed to fuss." "A little fussing is fine. This is bordering on ridiculous." But she loved him for it anyway. In late April, as promised, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Asher feared he might lose both Hannah and the baby. But Hannah was strong, and just after dawn on a clear spring morning, their son entered the world with a lusty cry. "He's perfect," Asher said in wonder, holding the tiny bundled baby. "Hannah, he's absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Hannah asked tiredly from the bed. They discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at his son's scrunched red face, Asher knew. "Thomas," he said. "After my brother who died when we were children, if that's all right with you." "Thomas Kincaid," Hannah tried it out. "It's perfect." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and chaotic and absolutely wonderful. Neither of them slept much, but when they did, Thomas was often nestled between them, his tiny breaths the sweetest sound either had ever heard. In June, James got leave and made the journey up to the mountain cabin. He brought his congratulations, gifts for his nephew, and the news that he'd been promoted to captain. "The Army is pleased with my work in Arizona," he explained, carefully holding his nephew for the first time. "They're talking about a transfer back to Colorado in another year or so. If that happens, maybe somewhere closer to you too, I'd like to be able to see my nephew grow up." "We'd like that too," Hannah said warmly. "Thomas should know his uncle." James stayed for 3 days, and by the time he left, he and Asher had developed a genuine friendship. As he mounted his horse to leave, James pulled Asher aside. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Last year when I told you Hannah deserved more than a mountain hermit, I was wrong. She deserves exactly what she has, a man who loves her completely, who builds her gardens and teaches her to shoot and looks at her like she hung the moon. Thank you for making my sister happy." "She makes me happy too," Asher replied. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again." "Good. That's all I wanted." James clasped Asher's shoulder. "Take care of them, always." As the years passed, life on the mountain settled into a rhythm. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to child, strong and healthy and curious about everything. Hannah taught him to read using the books in Asher's collection. Asher taught him to track animals, to fish, to survive in the wilderness. When Thomas was 3, they made the journey to Ohio to meet Asher's parents. It was a long trip, but worth it to see the joy on his mother's face when she met her grandson. They stayed for a month, and when they left to return to their mountain, it was with promises to visit again and an open invitation for Asher's parents to come to Colorado if they were able. In the spring of Thomas's 4th year, Hannah gave birth to a daughter. They named her Grace after Asher's mother, and she had her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gray eyes. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector from the first day. James did get his transfer back to Colorado, assigned to Fort Collins itself. He visited often, sometimes bringing fellow officers or friends. The cabin saw more visitors than it had in all the years before Hannah's arrival, but Asher found he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. The solitude that had once been necessary for his healing no longer felt essential. He'd learned to live with his past, to carry his memories without being crushed by them. When Grace was 2, Hannah became pregnant again. This time with twins, 2 more boys they named William and Frederick. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and suddenly, the once silent mountain rang with the laughter and shouts of children. "How did we end up with 4 children?" Asher asked one chaotic evening, holding a crying Frederick while trying to help Thomas with his reading and keeping an eye on William, who was attempting to climb the bookshelf. "I believe you know exactly how we ended up with 4 children," Hannah replied with an amused smile, nursing Grace while simultaneously stirring a pot on the stove. "True," Asher admitted, grinning, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As the children grew, the mountain cabin became a place of joy and love. The children learned to track and hunt and shoot from their father. They learned to raid and cook and garden from their mother. But most importantly, they learned what it meant to be loved completely and unconditionally. Hannah never regretted her decision to stay on the mountain. The life was hard sometimes. The winters were long, and yes, she was isolated from the society and culture she'd grown up with. But she had something more valuable, a partner who adored her, children who thrived, and a life built on love and shared purpose. Asher never stopped marveling at how his life had changed. The broken soldier who'd come to this mountain seeking only peace and solitude had found so much more. He'd found healing in Hannah's love, purpose in raising their children, and joy in the life they'd built together. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would think back to that autumn day when he'd heard a scream and gone running toward it instead of away. The best decision he'd ever made. Because running toward that scream had led him to Hannah, and Hannah had led him back to life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Asher and Hannah stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and crimson. The children were inside, Thomas keeping an eye on his younger siblings while their parents had a rare moment alone. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd made it to Fort Collins that day?" Asher asked, his arm around Hannah's waist. "If you'd never fallen, never hurt your ankle, never," Hannah said firmly. "I don't believe in wondering about roads not taken. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with a mountain man and 4 wild children in the middle of nowhere. With the love of my life and 4 beautiful children in the most beautiful place on earth," Hannah corrected. She turned in his arms to face him. "You saved me that day, Asher, not just from the mountainside but from a life that wasn't really living. You gave me purpose and love and a family. You gave me everything. You gave me more," Asher said softly. "You gave me back my humanity. You reminded me that I was more than my scars, more than my past. You showed me that it was possible to love and be loved, to build something lasting and good." He kissed her gently. "You saved me too, Hannah." They stood together as the sun set and the stars emerged, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was richer and fuller than either had dared to dream. Behind them, through the cabin windows, they could hear their children laughing. "Come on," Hannah said, tugging Asher toward the door. "Let's go inside. Grace wants you to read her a story before bed." "Which one?" "The one about the princess who saved herself." "That's your favorite too, isn't it?" Asher said with a knowing smile. "It is now," Hannah agreed. because it reminds me that sometimes the best stories are the ones where we save each other. They went inside together, into their warm, chaotic, love-filled cabin and closed the door on the mountain night. And if the walls could speak, they would have told a story about a man who found a woman broken on a mountainside, splinted her ankle, and carried her miles to safety. But more than that, they would have told the story of how that man and woman saved each other in all the ways that mattered, and built a life together that was everything either of them needed. Years continued to pass on the mountain. The children grew and eventually struck out on their own, though none went far. Thomas became a forest ranger, protecting the wilderness his father had taught him to love. Grace married a teacher from Fort Collins and brought grandchildren to visit every summer. William and Frederick took over their father's trap lines, working together as they'd always done, and built their own cabins nearby with wives they'd courted from town. Asher and Hannah grew old together on their mountain, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. They would sit on the porch that Asher had built all those years ago, holding hands and watching the seasons change, and count themselves the luckiest people alive. James eventually retired from the Army with the rank of colonel and built a house in Fort Collins. He never married, claiming that being Uncle James to Hannah's children and eventually their grandchildren was family enough for him. In their final years, when Asher's joints ached too much to check the trap lines and Hannah's eyes were too weak for fine sewing, they would still make the journey to their favorite spot on the mountain. The place where Asher had first found Hannah all those decades ago, injured and afraid. They'd sit there together, remembering that day and all the days that had followed. "Best fall I ever took," Hannah would say. "Best scream I ever heard," Asher would reply. And they would laugh together, two old people who had lived a love story better than any romance novel, who had built a life together from an accident and a good deed and hearts that were open enough to recognize love when it found them. When Asher finally passed away at the age of 78, he died peacefully in his sleep with Hannah holding his hand. His last words were, "Thank you for staying." Hannah lived another 2 years after Asher, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, telling stories about the man who had saved her on a mountainside, and then spent 50 wonderful years proving that true love was real and lasting and worth every sacrifice. When she died, also peacefully in her sleep, her children buried her next to Asher on the mountain they'd loved. The headstone reads simply, "Hannah Porter Kincaid, beloved wife, mother, and mountain woman she stayed, and beside it, Asher Kincaid, beloved husband, father, and mountain man, he carried her home. Their cabin remained standing for many years after, maintained by their descendants as a reminder of where their family began." And sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the pines, it almost sounded like laughter, like two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built something beautiful that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. The story of the mountain man who found her injured on the mountainside, splinted her ankle, and carried her miles to safety became family legend, passed down through generations. But those who heard it knew it wasn't just a story about a rescue. It was a story about courage and love, and choosing to take a chance on happiness, even when it came in unexpected forms. It was a story about two wounded people who healed each other, who built a life together against all odds, and who proved that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start with a scream on a mountainside and end with a lifetime of joy. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy Asher and Hannah left behind, not just their children and grandchildren, but the proof that love, real and true and lasting, was worth any risk, any hardship, any challenge. that sometimes saving someone else is the same as saving yourself. And that home isn't a place, but the person whose hand you want to hold through every sunset for the rest of your life.